Welcome to another video, macroeconomics. Today we're going to talk about the market for loanable funds. So far we have seen that investment must equal savings in a closed economy. We talk a bit about capital inflows, but we'll forget about that for our discussion here for now. And so, sure, savings equal investment, but how is that accomplished in practice? Savings, national savings essentially is the combination of the decision of millions of different households in an economy, government officials. It's not a centralized process. An investment is the result of the decision of, again, hundreds of thousands of companies deciding, making investment plans. And so how is that coordination achieved? Well, in essence, it's achieved, what we're going to show in this video is that can be achieved in the same way that people who produce apples know how many apples to bring to a market and coordinate with how many apples people want to buy. And that's through the price system in a market economy. And so we're going to have to think of our market. It's going to have a good. What is going to be the good? The funds that are available to be borrowed. We call those loanable funds. So that's how much money firms want to borrow for their investment project. Those funds are supplied by people who save, and people look at the price of selling or allowing their funds to be used for investment, of lending their funds. What is the reward you get for lending your funds? The reward you get is the interest rate. So the interest rate, in a sense, is the price that firms pay to private households for using their funds. And so we're going to think of the market for funds as it's no different than the market for apples. There's going to be suppliers of funds, which are private households who save, and they look at the interest rate, which is the reward they get for saving, and decide how much to save. Firms look at the cost of borrowing, which is the interest rate, and decide how much to borrow. And as a result, the interest rate will move until those two are balanced. Okay. Now, to put a little bit more structure on this, we're going to think, first we have to think about how do private households save and decide, make that decision, and what considerations firms make when deciding how much to invest. Okay, so let's start by asking ourselves the question, why do people save? There's a variety of reasons, at least we'll discuss a few here. The first one is what economists refer to as life-saving reasons. What are life-saving reasons? Essentially, it means your income is not going to be the same throughout all your life. It typically has an inverted U-shape. You start with low income when you first start, then you gain experience, you start making more, and then as you get old and retire, your income goes back down. So maybe when you're young, you want to borrow, that is to say have negative savings because you're going to make more money in the future. And then when you're getting older, you want to save some money for retiring. Or maybe when you're born, your parents want to start saving for college. So anything that has to do with these life cycle earnings are called life cycle savings, things that have to do with your life cycle. There's precautionary saving. You can summarize that as saving for a rainy day. There might be unexpected expenses that come your way, and you want to have a little bit of a fund to deal with those. Maybe you lose a job, maybe there's a medical emergency, whatever. And so you have to deal with those. Maybe Trump wins the presidency. No, just kidding. So, and then there's bequests. Maybe you care about your children. After you're gone from this world, you want to leave something for your children or your grandchildren or whatever. So you save so you have some wealth to pass down to the future generations. And there may be other reasons, but that's the main things we consider. Essentially, we want to think of the decision of saving as you're sacrificing present consumption. I could eat a chocolate today, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put this aside. And in return, what do I get? I get to consume a piece of chocolate in the future. So saving essentially is about substituting less consumption today for more consumption in the future. So that's, in some sense, the decision you're making. It's a trade-off between present consumption and future consumption. Now, the amount that people choose to save depends on a variety of factors in the economic environment, but importantly, as we say, the real interest rate is the price or the reward that you get from saving. And so the more you get rewarded for saving, the more you're getting rewarded for sacrificing consumption today. In other words, the higher the real interest rate, if you consume one less chocolate bar today, that means you're getting extra chocolate in the future, the higher the real interest rate. And so the higher the real interest rate, you would expect people to save more. Now, obviously, you have to be careful there because there's other factors. That would be what we call a substitution effect. There's also other factors that say, hey, the real interest rate is higher if you already own a lot of money. That if you have a big mortgage payment debt, that means you are poorer. Maybe you will decide, to change your consumption in response to that. So there might be some income effects that we'll choose to ignore, and we'll just only focus on that effect that the more you get rewarded for sacrificing present consumption, the more you're going to do that, and so the more you're going to save. Now, as I was saying, there's the income effect that if you are a net borrower and you have debt, then that means, higher interest rate makes you poorer, and so it make you save more because you consume less because you're poorer. Or if you're a net lender, let's say you have a big 401k, you have big retirement savings, and now returns go up. Now you feel like, I'm wealthier, so you maybe save less. So, but that depends on whether you're a net borrower or a net lender. And in an economy, when you're looking at the aggregate, for every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar lent. So you would think that those effects kind of cancel out in the aggregate. It may not be exactly true, but that would be a bit of a simplifying assumption we'll make. And we'll ignore the income effects and just focus on the substitution effect. And so putting all of that together, if we were to plot the amount that people want to save on the horizontal axis, we call that the quantity of loanable funds. That's in dollars. How many dollars are people saving? And that money is money that people don't want to consume today, so it's available to be given out as a loan. How would this happen in practice? People will put their money in the bank. The bank acts as an intermediary between savers and the firms. It will take the funds, and then it will turn around to firms and offer loans to the firms. And we'll discuss more in detail that in a later video. But here, what we try to highlight is if we plot that amount of funds available and how that varies with the real interest rate that we put on the vertical axis, what we're going to see is that there's a kind of upward sloping curve. In other words, if you look at a point like X, when the interest rate is 4%, the return on saving is 4%. In our example, there will be $15 billion available for banks to give out as loans. If the real interest rate was higher and 12%, then a lot of people who at 4% decided, hey, I'm going to, buy a cheeseburger, now decide, hey, I'm going to put the money in the bank and save. And so that means now available, maybe there are $45 billion. So there will be more money available for funds. This is an illustration. It doesn't mean that these numbers mean anything. It's just to give you an example to illustrate that this curve slopes up. This curve we're going to call the supply of loanable funds. It tells us how does the amount of money that the banks have available to give out as loans that come from the saving decision of household, how much of that money is available to be given out as loans. And when we move the real interest rate, we're moving from a point X to a point Y on the curve, but there may be some factors that switch this curve up and down. For example, if people get worried about the future, they may increase their precautionary savings. And if they increase their precautionary savings, now at the same interest rate of 4%, they may choose to save more than $15 billion. And so the curve will move up or to the right. And then there may be other factors affecting private behavior that is not the interest rate. That will be a movement of the curve, not a movement along the curve. As I was saying, because there are people are human beings and they're not perfectly rational, there are psychological factors that affect savings decision. People may want to save, but they don't have the self-control. If they have the money, they burns in their hand and they spend it. There might be demonstration effects where people just want to spend money to show off how much money they have because it makes them feel good that other people think they're rich or things like that. So the saving decision is kind of complex. Talk about saving decisions. Let's look a little bit. This is the savings rate. So this is the fraction of total income in the economy that is saved. So it's the ratio between national savings and GDP. For the U.S. You can see the U.S. in the 1970s, the savings rate was about between 15 and 10%. It went as low in the early 2000s to be below 5%. So that means most of the income was being spent. And then after the crisis, it went up a little bit, but it still stayed well below 10%. During COVID, obviously, there was a big increase in savings because people didn't have anywhere to go, so they didn't have anywhere to spend. But now you can see the savings rate has gone back down to about 5%. Let's compare this with China. What is the savings rate for China? Well, you can see the savings rate for China is approximately between 40 and 50%. So that's essentially an order of magnitude higher. China, for every dollar income they make, they save half of it. And as we saw, where does that go? It goes to investment. That's why you've seen in China a huge increase in infrastructure, universities, technology, all of this stuff coming from the savings. In the US, there's not that much savings. All of the investment, a lot of the investment, as we saw in the previous video, is coming from abroad. Now let's look at the decision to why do firms invest. Essentially, firms invest because that allows them to increase their productive capacity in the future. It may be by building a new plant, making new buildings, anything that it will increase their workers' productivity and allow them to produce more in the future. And hopefully they expect that the return on that investment will be higher than the cost of borrowing their funds. They borrow the funds, they pay a cost that is the real interest rate, and then they have a return on the project. And if the return on the project is higher than the cost of borrowing the funds, then that investment opportunity will be profitable. And so we would expect here that the higher the interest rate, so when the interest rate is 12%, only those projects that have a return higher than 12% will be profitable. And then if we lower the real interest rate to 4%, now all those projects who had a return rate between 12 and 4%, now those projects become profitable. And so we'll expect the demand for loans to go up because now there's more firms who want to invest, and so they want to borrow the funds. Obviously, there's other factors that may affect the decision, like if taxes change, policies by the government, new perceived business opportunities, the AI revolution, everybody wants to invest on AI, whatever, there may be affecting this curve. Now, once again, as the same as before, movement of the real interest rate represents, as in this example, a movement from point A to point B along the curve. Any factor that is not the real interest rate that changes the demand for loans, how much firms want to borrow, will be a movement of the curve. If it increases for the same interest rate, firms want to borrow more, it will move the curve up or to the right. If firms want to borrow less, it will move the curve to the left or down. And finally, we can talk about what is the equilibrium interest rate. The equilibrium interest rate is the interest rate that will guarantee that there is balance in the market and the total of funds available for loans from the bank are exactly how much the banks want to borrow. So in this example, and this works no different than the market for apples, let's review, let's say the interest rate is 12%. That's a very high return for sacrificing consumption. So savings at that interest rate is higher than investment. So firms want to borrow, but the bank has all these funds that nobody wants to borrow sitting around. So the bank is likely to say, well, I'm going to lower the interest rate so I can start get rid of these funds because people are saving a lot of money, but firms don't want to borrow it. If the interest rate is 4%, so it's low, below the equilibrium, now the return of saving is very low. So people are not saving that much. For firms, borrowing money is very cheap. So there's a lot of investment projects and a lot of demand for loans. And so now the banks have a lot of firms who want to borrow, but they don't have enough funds. And if funds become scarce, well, banks are going to say, okay, now I'm going to charge more, and interest rates will go up. Eventually, you arrive at a point of equilibrium where the interest rate in this example would be 8%, and the amount that people save in this case will be $30 billion. It's exactly equal to the amount of loans that firms want to take, and all of the market is in equilibrium. Okay. So this is the basic idea. At this point, this is not dramatically useful, but then this model becomes interesting once we start introducing shocks and thinking how different shocks to the demand for loans and the supply for loans will they affect the total saving and investment in an economy and the interest rate. Okay, let's finish here. Thank you for watching.